Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to our third webinar of the Fundamentals of Restorative Justice series hosted by the South Carolina Restorative Justice Initiative. As you all know by now, my name is Aparna Pulavarapu. I am the Executive Director and Founder at SCRJI and an Associate Professor of Law at the University of South Carolina School of Law. So we're going to start again by reminding you of a few items. You will see that you are only able to chat with panelists. The chat is being monitored by Torres, who is ensuring that our technology runs smoothly. Other attendees cannot see this chat, and panelists will not be reading this chat. So if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A if you would like the moderator to see it. South Carolina bar members who are seeking CLE credit, please keep an eye on the chat. You will be prompted approximately every 15 minutes to submit your SC bar number. You must do this so that we can certify your continued presence in this webinar to the Commission on CLE. Again, we're planning to send a survey at the conclusion of the 8 weeks, but are interested in any immediate feedback that you may have. So we will be posting a link in the chat so that if you have any immediate thoughts you want to share after watching this webinar, you are welcome to do that. We do have sign interpretation, and you should be able to see it on the side of the screen. If you cannot see it, if you look at your screen on the top right-hand corner, you'll see an icon that says View. If you click on View, you should click on Split Screen Gallery View, and you'll be able to see everybody. We also have live captioning. And to access live captioning, please click on the closed caption icon on your Zoom screen. Thank you. So I'm thrilled today to be joined by Todd Augusta-Scott, who will be discussing restorative approaches to working with people who commit intimate partner violence. His work was featured in the documentary film that we all watched, A Better Man. And that film, if you haven't had a chance yet to see it, will be available on our website through tomorrow. I do suggest watching it. It's very powerful. Because of the nature of this discussion, some of you may need some time to step away. It can be quite upsetting. Please note that we are recording this, and it will be available for a limited time on our website to all participants. So if you need some time, take some time to yourself, and you can come back and watch the recording at a later time. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to Todd so he can talk to us about his work.
Okay, so I'm glad to be here for sure. Talking from Nova Scotia, Canada. And if there's ever any, if the reception's not working, if you could just wave at me and I'll see if there's a few more buttons on this side that I can press. So my name's Todd, and I've been working in the field for the last 25 years. And what I'm going to be sharing is really so for people who've watched the film A Better Man, which is a restorative approach to intimate partner violence. And I'm going to be sharing really the kind of theoretical template that's underneath the film and the work that I was doing. So for those who, should I assume that some people haven't seen it? Should I give a little outline of the film? Okay. So basically the film was about a woman who was she was beat up by her partner severely, chronically over a 2-year period when they were teenagers. And that left her with serious post-traumatic stress for 20 years. And she also joined the shelter movement during that time period. And so part of what what she wanted to do was she met the person with the guy later on in life on the street, and they met a few times, and then it occurred to her that if I meet him again, I'm going to ask him if he'll let me interview him about our relationship. And so what she did was she got camera and her friend behind the camera, and I asked him if he would do it. They did, lo and behold, they did meet again, and she asked him if he would do it, and he agreed. So she got a friend behind the camera, went to a coffee shop, and actually interviewed him for 2.5 hours about the violence that he had perpetrated towards her. When she was done, uh, she didn't really know what to make of the material that she had, of what she had just done. You know, it seemed powerful to her, but she didn't quite know how to make meaning of it in terms of, was he sincere, and was this for real, and what does this mean? So she had connected with me through my writing in the field, and asked me if I would look at some of the raw footage, which shows up in the um, video at the front end of the film. And so what happens is, so she gets me to look at it, and I see that these two are trying to have similar conversations that I've been having in my office for quite a while, where in this case, men are trying to take responsibility for the harm that they had done towards their partners, and are wanting to be part of the repair of the effects of what they've done. And so um, so I just recognized some of those threads, and as a result of that, then she ended up flying me to Toronto a number of times, and I worked with, so his name was Steve and she's a Tia, and I worked with Steve numerous times and had conversations with a Tia, and then eventually we had these conversations together about repairing harm, and Steve going through a process where he was acknowledging what he had what he had done, looking at the effects, and looking at this even as part of the repair process for Tia, and him working at that repair, not just individually but also socially. So part of what comes out of the film is the film started for Atia. So Atia was the person who was, subjected to the violence, but she was also the director of the film. And part of what happens through my involvement with the film, I think when Atia first started, she thought the film was going to be focused on kind of dissecting Steve and finding out like how violence works, so then it could be stopped. And just through this process, the film, through engaging me in this restorative sensibility, the process really became like what would actually happen if a guy actually did take responsibility for what he had done, and what difference would that make to the person he actually harmed. And so in this film, part of what happens is through this process is the severe post-traumatic stress that Atia had lived with for 20 years begins to dissipate through her contact with Steve and him taking responsibility in front of her, where she was, earlier on, she wasn't able to wear scarves. She always had to have her back to the corner in a restaurant. She always had a safety plan for 20 years when she's leaving the house. That all that stuff started to dissipate as she engaged Steve in these kind of conversations about his acknowledgement, his hearing his plan for it not to happen again to anybody, hearing about his willingness to look at the effects and then to look at repairing the effects, which part of the film is documented. So that's just a bit of a snapshot of the film. And really the film, I'm going to talk about different phases of the work. But maybe just before I go further down that trail in terms of talking about the template of the film, I do want to just identify the context of my work more. So I've been in this field for 25 years. In Nova Scotia, where I am, the work with men who've used violence against their female partners really developed out of the shelter movement. We were really developed under the Department of Community Services in Nova Scotia government department, as opposed to criminal justice. So we weren't funded through criminal justice, and that didn't happen really in any other place in Canada. It happened in Nova Scotia, and it really lent itself for the work to change and grow, and I would argue become more restorative over the years. I was initially trained with Ellen Pence and Michael Paymer in Duluth. So I was trained in the Duluth model, and I did that for a number of years. And there's a lot of wisdom from that work that I carry forward. And I also get introduced to the work of Alan Jenkins and Michael White through out of Australia, and some of the narrative therapy work that they were doing. And then more recently, describing my work in terms of restorative justice. So I just want to move then to talking about this idea of the IPV Repair Triangle. And so I'm conceptualizing the work now in terms of really three phases of the work, and starting from the bottom. And this is so the two triangles here I'm really thinking of as the two separate parties that are involved in this intimate partner violence. So the first phase is, and I'm going to slow each one of these down, but I just want to give you an overview of the phases. The first phase is establishing safety for both parties, and really that's part of the police response, child protection response, and shelters trying to set up safety for the individuals involved, physical safety. What I also mean at that stage is also attending counselors attending to the the hyper and hypoarousal that comes out of trauma, for often for both parties when they're experiencing the effects of trauma. And so part of that is also people being able to self-regulate, so they actually feel safe in their bodies and can regulate those effects of trauma. So that's part of phase one. So on top of that, when people are feeling safe enough, then the individual work, again, this is done separately with the two parties. So the individual work is really about developing plans, proposals for plans for both stopping the abuse. So of course, it's the person who's perpetrated the abuse who needs to take responsibility to stop it. And there is a whole internal process that goes on there in terms of um, going through a process of being able to spot the warning signs when it comes in the field. It's, there's all kinds of different ways of describing it in terms of control logs and so forth. But basically being able to spot the warning signs and what you need to remind yourself of to stay on track. So there's a whole internal plan. There's often a lot of issues around trauma for some of the extreme stuff that guys need to be attentive to, how they're confusing the past with the present. I'm going to speak more about that. And also ideas around masculinity that often gets packed into these moments, which I'll attend to. So there's an internal plan, but also there's an external plan, like this idea of taking a time out or something like that, or any other ideas the guys have, that it's often helpful to. So the process here of this phase two and phase three is about trying to repair harm without creating more harm. So when I'm developing the kind of stop the abuse plan with a guy, it is helpful that we make sure that that plan is good for her. So just for example, just a common one in terms of if a guy's learning how to take a time out and he takes off for 2 hours and she doesn't know where he is, I mean, that may be part of his plan and she hasn't any idea about what's going on there. So, again, that external plan. So his internal stuff, what he needs to remind himself is stuff that he can do, but there's an external part of that plan that may have direct implications for her that he would need to check out with her. What impact his plan to stop the abuse is actually going to have on her. And also in terms of it's also about looking about how do you respond when you've both, been harmed, and also when you've harmed somebody. How do you respond in a way that actually leads to repair? So really both parties want to be considering that. So I'm going to talk more about that, but I just want to move to phase three just for a second. So then that moves on when people are prepared to respond in a way that's restorative, that's going to repair harm without creating more harm, and they have developed a plan around stopping the abuse and also a proposed plan for repairing the abuse. And she's also, if it's she who's been victimized, is also working on a similar process where she's thinking about what the effects have been and what the harm has been to her and what will be helpful in terms of the repair. So those are conversations that she's engaged with as well. Then that would move to the third phase, which is then being able to help facilitate conversations or communication. So so I want to be clear here. What both parties are learning is how to respond when I've been harmed and how do I respond when I've harmed others. So they're again respond in a way that they're not creating more harm as they try and repair harm. So what uh, of course, this restorative communication between the parties would only open up if both parties were in phase 3. So we wouldn't be taking a guy who's unsafe, and in phase 1 and is not able to, regulate himself and is blaming other people and blaming her and all that, the stuff that you would work through phase 1 and phase 2. We'd only be taking into phase 3 and opening up that communication with a guy who is actually taking responsibility. So part of what, but even for so that work, if they do both end up in phase 3, and so on her part, it's, moving into phase 3 would be meaning that through phase 1 and phase 2, she was able to move away from ideas of revenge as justice or retribution, that she's actually looking towards repair. Repair of the harm, which may not repair the intimate relationship, but it repairs the harm. And that's part of why I like the film, is because the film is actually not focusing on, it's not about repairing an intimate relationship. Their relationship happened 20 years earlier. It's really about Steve coming forward and Tia coming forward to repair the harm that Steve did to her. So but in the event that both parties do, like in The Better Man, reach point where they're both in phase 3, they're able to have conversations that actually lead to repair. That's kind of in that golden triangle piece. So that's kind of the work with the person who either brought you into counseling or brought you into the Department of Justice or whatever the case. But phase 3 is trying to empower both parties just to be in relationships in a way where they can take responsibility when they harm others, and also when they've been harmed, so they can become responsive and know how to respond in a way that actually leads to repair. So I'm going to actually slow that down a little bit more as I move on here. So this phase 3, just in terms of what often people who have harmed tell us that they want in these kind of situations, is for to acknowledge, for the person who did the harm to acknowledge the abuse, agreeing to a plan to stop the abuse. So again, this is the person who's been harmed having input on the plan in terms of, what in this case, what the guy's going to do. Acknowledging the effects of the abuse. So this process in this phase 3 communication. And again, when I'm saying communication, I'm being intentionally, I'm not thinking, I think often restorative is associated with circles or face-to-face communication. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm really talking about communication that it may happen face-to-face like it does in the film, but it also may happen through, it also may happen through letters, through emails, through video conferencing. It's whatever is not going to create more harm for either party. So so we're monitoring safety, of course, throughout this whole process, because again, we're committed to repairing harm without doing more harm. So there's acknowledging the effects of the abuse, and then agreeing to a plan to repair the effects. So pulling, and again, they're prepared at this, they've gone through each one of these 4 pieces in phase 2. So they've already invested in thinking about all these ideas before they get to phase 2. Okay, just a second. For some reason, there we go. So again, so the documentary really is an illustration of phase 3. And so I do want to lay more of the ground level in terms of what happened before to make that those conversations possible. Because it makes sense to me if people thought that we were rushing into those kind of conversations that are in the film, they would, understandably be nervous about that. So looking at, I want to be clear just in terms of my own journey in this work. When I first started this work, I never would have thought about restorative justice being a possibility. Like, it really wasn't on the radar that repair would be possible. It wasn't even that I thought it was impossible. it was just really like, I never thought about it. Like really, we were just focused on, kind of stopping the violence. And we were pretty cynical about actually stopping the violence. And part of that was in part because we were hyper focused on safety. In some ways, I kind of see us being stuck in phase one as workers, where that's all we could think about was safety, safety, and we didn't anything that we. Um, so even the models that we had, so just for example, that we really from Duluth, we had this important story about men wanting power and control in relationships, and that power and control story about men using power and control or wanting power and control in relationships, using power and control tactics, and getting power and control from using violence. And that's an important story in the work for sure. And just over the years, I just recognized that it's one story that's important in the work. There's many different stories with the men that I need to be able to pull into the conversations to actually attend to their violence. And part of the danger of only having that story and thinking that that explained what was going on in its entirety, there's all kinds of dangers to that. One is which it left me with this idea that the men actually that the violence was simply working for the men, and that maybe some of them even liked it, and that the kind of world was revolving around them because they were abusing their family members. And really that description of most of the men that I work with are completely marginalized by poverty and racism and everything else. And to describe them as powerful and in control because they're hurting their people that they care about is just like it doesn't resonate that much with the men. I mean, I really tried to force feed that to men for a lot of years about how much power and control they had because they were hurting the people that they love. And again, it's not that the power and control story is not influential on the man. It's not that masculinity isn't being influential in the men's lives, but just the idea that it was actually leading that to work, and that the violence was working. Part of the effect of that on me was the fact that I was ended up really trivializing the cost in the men's lives of their abuse and their violence. I really didn't like spend enough time with that. I just had this story that it was working, and I didn't really allow for the cost of the violence to come to the focus. And I just over time, it's like that's extremely important to actually stop the violence. It's about allowing the cost to come forward, and for the men to actually consider what they want in their relationships, and then also look at the harm that's being done. So part of that cycle of violence stuff kind of kept me from seeing the cost of the violence for the men. So I didn't think that they even wanted to stop violence. Of course, I wasn't going to do restorative justice. I wasn't going to put her in the room with somebody who only wanted power and control. So again, I had these stereotypes too of the men, that they only wanted power and control. And it's not that they don't want power and control, but they also often want love, caring, and kindness too. So their values and what they want is often contradictory. But I just fit within an either or framework in the early days, where I thought you either want power and control or you want love, caring, and respect. And of course, most of these guys want both because they've got this influence of masculinity happening. And at the same time, they want loving, caring relationships with their partners. So those stereotypes also, the men only wanted power and control, kept me from actually uh, thinking that restorative justice was possible. And also, um, so there's many other examples in terms of just the different, just another one that kind of stands out is we sometimes, of course, this audience will be familiar with this whole cycle of violence metaphor. And of course, sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. But I think part of the intention behind that theorizing around cycle of violence was that it was trying to highlight that kind of hollow promises and apologies afterwards, after the violence, are hollow promises and apologies. They can be hollow promises and apologies, but part of the and that doesn't necessarily lead to change. But part of what we did with that was, I mean, the shame that guys feel and remorse that the guys feel afterwards, after they've perpetrated abuse, often their values come back into focus in terms of with the damage that they've done. Um, Part of what we did was, and when guys would try and like make their own attempts at repair, sometimes they were sincere, sometimes they weren't, but in some ways we couldn't tell the difference. So basically any time the guy was trying to make some progress, or even they were making progress together, she was coming in saying that he made progress after using abuse. We had this kind of cycle of violence wheel where anything that was good that was possibly going on in the relationship in terms of repair, we just pathologized as the honeymoon stage. Like, oh, we know where this is going. Oh, it's good now, but we know where it's going. So there was really a pathologizing of these relationships. So even anything that was good was just labeled as the honeymoon stage. So again, with that, it was hard to think about why you would want to move into a restorative justice conversation. If even if the guys were changing, I wasn't even able to see it because I just was pathologizing it as a honeymoon phase. I didn't actually see it as seeds of taking responsibility, seeds of being able to move towards repair. So there's all kinds of things that actually, in retrospect, kept me from thinking that restorative justice was even a possibility. Um, so um, also, I'm going to be talking about trauma uh, and gender and identity and gender in the work. And I really never thought that was going to be possible either. I was slow to come to that. I mean, it's always been in the conversations. It can't not be. But in terms of actually, talking about it and amplifying it at all in the conversations with men, I really never thought that was going to be possible because I thought part of what was going to happen, we were nervous about, so what we did in the early days is we were nervous to go near any of the men's stories of, being abused or, childhood experiences of violence or other experiences of violence because we thought that we were going to lose the responsibility piece. We thought we were going to end up in a place where we're making excuses for men and they're, justifying and excusing their abusive behavior. And so as a result, what men would come in with horrendous stories of racism and poverty and other men's violence and the violence that they've experienced growing up. And we really didn't know how to deal with that because we thought, again, we had to work with them as either perpetrators or victims just to hold them responsible and accountable. And so we would just tell them, and we're not here to talk about, how you've been harmed in life. We're only here to talk about how you've harmed other people. And we just encourage them maybe to take that other stuff to a therapist or something. We're just here to talk to you about how you've harmed other people. So that wasn't very helpful. uh, Part of what happened was we moved to a space where we could actually think about the man as both perpetrating abuse, having been victimized by abuse, being oppressing people and having been oppressed himself, and that we could think about him as powerful and powerless and 100% responsible for his choices at the same time. And so again, we thought we had to choose between those to actually hold the men responsible. But what I actually find is that if I can move into a space where I can allow the guys to talk responsibly about being harmed, that is actually a gateway to get the men to actually talk about harming other people. I often can just talk to a guy and ask him questions like, what's it like to be in a situation where you're being asked, if I'm talking to a guy, if you're being asked to, take responsibility for the harm you've done, but no one's being asked to take responsibility for the harm that they've done to you. What's it like to be in that position, where people only care about you taking responsibility and not other people. And so those become important conversations so the guys can talk about the ways in which they've been harmed or abused or whatever else, but it never takes the focus off the fact that they still need to take responsibility for theirs. But there's often a injustice that got set up when I would only allow the men to talk about how they were responsible, and we just didn't focus on anybody else in terms of like the harms that they may have experienced. I also was nervous in terms of going near trauma because I thought it was going to undermine. It was kind of like a psychological analysis of the issue, and I thought it was going to undermine a sociological analysis of the issue. And I really, so thinking of the issue in terms of trauma being a psychological analysis, and then social analysis, thinking in terms of masculinity. But really now I see that they are both important in terms of understanding specifically what is happening with these men and guiding my kind of curiosity in my conversations with the men. I find that that is uh, that it's important to be able to attend to both. That it's not one, it's not either a social analysis or a psychological analysis. I find it's important uh, that the men can speak of both in actually stopping their violence and repairing the harm. Um, so also, I was I was nervous about going near the trauma conversation. I'm going to go there in just a second. I was also nervous because I recognize that not all men who are traumatized go on to abuse people. So there's no like direct linear causality there. Most men who are abused in childhood don't go on to abuse. So it's not, there's no kind of linear causality with experiencing violence and then perpetrating violence necessarily. Again, lots of people don't. And at the same time, the fact that 95% of the men that I work with, they actually have horrendous violence done to them. And do I think that that has something to do with why they're abusing their partners and other people? Is that often, yeah, that those experiences are connected. And so I want to be able to, and so, and how they're connected is, uh, it's not per se being abused in childhood that actually kind of translates, I think, in abuse in adulthood. It's the meaning that's made of the abuse. So so narrative therapy is what I'm drawing on here for just this idea, and it's not unique to narrative therapy. Uh, but part of the idea is that if I the narrative is the idea that we perform identities about ourselves. So again, if I'm thinking about myself as so if we tell little Johnny that you're bad, you're bad, you're bad, you're bad, and we let little Johnny grow up, he'll perform that identity about himself, that he's bad, and he'll just show us how bad he can be. So there'll be a performance of an identity. And so again, or if like little Johnny's beaten and he's getting the message that you're being beaten because you're disgusting and dirty and so forth, that the meaning of the being beaten and the identity, the performance that comes off of that is much different than a guy who's being abused by parents or by his father or whatever in childhood, but has an aunt who's saying, well, that's wrong that that's being done to you. That's, you're a good kid, you're a good boy, that's not right. This is, this isn't who you are. And that kid grows up with a sense that the violence was the problem, and people perpetrating violence was the problem, that he wasn't to blame for that, and that he's a loving, caring boy as he's growing up. That just leads to a much different um, performance of identity. So again, it's not the per se being abused that's the issue, it's the meaning that's made of it in terms of identity, that's part of what's being performed. So I want to look at so just a little deeper look at safety. So I wanted to preface that with never thinking RJ was possible, and also never thinking looking at trauma was possible with these men. So looking at the issue of safety, so in terms of as I mentioned earlier, part of this safety is about looking at the community actors that help establish safety, drawing on police, child protection, and women's shelters as part of that, establishing safety for individuals, and then also looking at to the counselors helping individuals to self-regulate their bodies. That's with the hypo and hyperarousal. And also that's done through establishing values when harmed others. So there's a whole process of when people come in, grounding them through just asking them what's important to them, what are they wanting in terms of their relationships, how would they prefer their relationships to be in terms of love, caring, and kindness, and that there's a whole grounding experience to that. But it also helps, especially with the people who've done the harm, it helps to ground them in the idea that they know that I know that there's more about them than just their violence. You know, that I know that he's also a guy who may want safety for his kids, even though his practices are taking him in the opposite direction, that he still may want to be a caring, loving dad, even though he's perpetrating abuse, that I can be in those kind of contradictions, that kind of, and not get pulled into the either or space, which is what we always did, with the idea that it was the behavior that defined what the men's values were. I find that often that's, I mean, that often I want to highlight actually the tensions between the men's, how the men might prefer to be and what their violence is. So in the moment, I mean, they intend the violence and they intend to hurt people. And when I invite them to step back and look at their relationships and what they want, you know, often that they say that, you know, they don't want their kids to be scared of them. That's often a very painful conversation for a lot of the men that I work with. So part of grounding them is this idea of establishing values. Also, in terms of this phase one, so in a restorative sense, it's both being able to be responsive to people who are at high risk, which is, you know, the safety and the police and the women's shelters and so forth. So wanting to be able to be responsive to those, and also be responsive to people who are not as high risk. And so part of this process is, and just in terms of kind of like how I was stuck in phase one in the early work, because I kind of had a stereotype of who all the men were that I was talking with. Um, I kind of thought everybody coming through the door was at A, and if the goal is to get to Z, I always thought that they were just coming in a day and they had to take, you know, these individual sessions. They had to take a 20-week group, and then they'd have to do something after that, and then, you know, before they, you know, would be able to maybe have some kind of restorative conversation, even though we didn't think that far ahead. But the point was, just over time, I recognized not all guys are coming in a day. Some guys are coming in at M. Some guys are coming in at W. Like they can, and she's not terrorized. You know, again, that was a stereotype we had of her, terrorized and she wants to leave. It's just that's not actually, doesn't describe the majority of women that we work with. And that, so part of it is trying to be responsive to the individual woman and what she wants, and who's in front of us, and also in terms of what his capacity is, and being able to assess levels of safety, then being able to work with them to the individual work that they would do in preparation for the repair that can happen at phase 3. So by the individual work, part of what I mean by that is, again, going through this process of acknowledging abuse. So, I mean, often the people who've been harmed, you know, and they've experienced a lot of trauma, haven't really slowed down to consider this as well. I mean, some of them have, and some of them haven't. So actually acknowledging the abuse can be quite a painful experience for the person who's been harmed, and also for the person who's done the harm. That I do that work individually. So because and what I'm thinking about is, I mean, if they thought of it in terms of abuse and we're actually slowing it down and looking at it, that is actually helpful in stopping the violence, because often, again, there's a lot of denial and minimizing going on, as we know in this field. And so part of moving through that, it makes sense to me that the solution to that is about the guys actually exploring what what the abuse was. And because I'm also preparing them, if there's an opportunity to acknowledge the abuse in phase 3, that she's going to be talking about abuse. It's going to be very painful, as it is for Steve in the film. He needs to be prepared for that. That can't be like shock value every time he hears something where he's going to move into defensiveness. So this is part of this, is preparing him in terms of studying the abuse. Again, coming up with this idea of a proposed plan to stop the abuse, and acknowledging the effects of the abuse. So and again, it'll be for both parties. Even the person who's harmed might not actually be clear about what has the harm been, you know, this abuse that I've experienced. So slowing that down, and then looking at a proposed plan to repair the effects. So it's for the guy, if it's the guy who's used the abuse, it's not, uh, and I know throughout this conversation, I'm using that kind of straight configuration, and we can talk more about that. But I'm just using that for shorthand. There's lots more complexity in the work than that, but just to footnote that. So acknowledging the effects of the abuse and the proposed plan for repairing the effects. So often the person who's been harmed often needs to come, what would help? They often have to think, what would I want? So again, just that looking at what were the effects of what happened to me, and then what would I want. That's part of preparation for those conversations as well. And it's not just about leaving it, in this case, for her to think about. It's also for him to come to the table with ideas that he thinks would, one, what the effects might be, and then what the possible effects are. And again, there's also going to be a process about moving through this repairing harm without harm and looking at what that means. So phase two also is going to look at issues of trauma. So I just want to spend a little bit of time with this. So in phase two, these trauma is not always present. That's the first thing I want to say in terms of domestic violence. Again, it's not all high-end terror stuff. There's, as we know, there's a kind of range of abuse and risk factors. And so when there is, so some people, again, could move through the phases quite quickly, depending on where they're coming in at the in terms of their readiness to engage kind of in a restorative process. And some people are very traumatized, and that's going to be a slower process for them to move through these phases. And part of the trauma, so with the guys, is that often they come in, part of their experience of trauma leaves them, their own trauma leaves them with this idea that they're either only a victim or only a perpetrator. So often guys come in really with horrendous violent childhoods, and they come out of those childhoods thinking that everybody, the world's hostile, and especially close relationships are hostile. And so they end up in close relationships, and they're treating their partners as if their partners are an abusive parent, basically, and they only see themselves as defending themselves. But again, they're getting confused with retaliation and all kinds of other stuff. But there's this sense that they are justified because they're being harmed to perpetrate abuse. So they can come in with that. So that needs to be attended to in terms of moving away from this idea that they're only victims, although without dismissing the fact that they have been victimized. Again, moving them to a place where they can also acknowledge they're responsible for their choices. Or some guys also come in with the idea of only being perpetrators. So you get guys who also come in with a self-loathing, like I'm no good, I'm terrible, I'm bad, I'm evil, and this is just more evidence of that. In the early days, we thought that those guys were actually just success stories. The guys who would beat up on themselves and just engage that self-loathing, with, all right, this guy gets how bad and evil he really is. We're getting somewhere with this one. And now I just see that's pretty unhelpful, just because part of this process is it does need to, so just part of where that leads to in terms of that self-loathing, if that's all that ends up as a result of this process, part of where that leads to is, again, a performance of identity. If a guy comes in and he's feeling like he's a monster, and which I did for years, confronted guys, and I was really oppositional with them, and they left my office thinking that they were monsters. And now in retrospect, I just see where that kind of performance of identity lead to. If he came in thinking he was just a batterer and left thinking he's just a batterer, I just have a sense that that didn't really disrupt much in terms of what he felt was possible for him in his relationships. So moving him away from this idea that he's only abusive or only a perpetrator is also an important part of the work. Also, trauma has a way of undermining people's power and agency. So part of what often these guys feel is pretty powerless to do anything about their lives, that they just feel done to in life. That often comes from a childhood where it didn't matter if you turned right or turned left, you got beaten, where your choices didn't actually translate into anything. And so often they come in thinking that this is just the way I am. And so again, that erosion of power and agency. needs to be attended to. There's often a lot of confusion around what they're responsible for. So um, some guys can come in and when they're looking back, they often, when they look back at their childhoods, they can be blaming themselves for, their father's violence towards them. Part of it is trying to separate out, I'm responsible for my choices and other people are responsible for their choices. I'll talk more about that in a bit. And also, they often come in without any template for taking responsibility or repair. Like, this is not an idea that usually most of the guys are coming in with. What most of these guys are coming in with is that if you made mistakes or made bad choices, you were beaten. That's the template they have for once you've made a mistake or once you've, screwed up. There is no template for how do you repair stuff. So again, when it's kind of traumatic childhoods, the guys often come in and say, just, well, what's done is done. There's nothing I can do about it now. And that just often speaks to they really don't have a road for repair, and so this is part of what this is trying to attend to. Or this idea that they've made bad choices means they are bad, as opposed to making bad choices. Or also thinking, again, that responsibility, that punishment equals punishment rather than the possibility of repair. And confusing the past with the present, which I mentioned earlier about confusing their partners with past partners or others. So addressing these issues of trauma is extremely important in terms of actually interrupting the men's abusive behavior. If they only see their abuse, they won't see, when they come in, they do not see their, often do not see their behavior in terms of abuse. We're trying to convince them it is abuse. Part of that's about is they see it as self-defense. They're confusing retaliation with self-defense. They're confusing the fact that they're not victims all the time, in terms of this hostile world that they've come out of. So that all this stuff needs to be attended to. What I would also, so this is, very fast movement through this material, I recognize. I also though want to say, in terms of trauma and the victim, there's also, a parallel process going on here where, and these 7 are the same as we're on for the perpetrator. Often the victim is coming in traumatized and thinking of herself as either all the problem, he would stop the abuse if I wasn't such a problem. That's like her being, or her being only a victim and feeling powerless and without agency, like no matter what she does, it doesn't matter. I mean, they could enter into the relationships with those kind of same experiences of trauma or pick it up when they're in that relationship. But that all needs to be attended to, before she can move into phase 3 and actually feel like she can make a difference and have influence in terms of what she wants being important, and being able to ask for that. Also, that confusion around responsible and not responsible. So again, women can come in blaming themselves for the abuse, and they may have taken up that template when, as children are blamed for their violence that they experience. Well, women can just import that into this relationship where they were responsible for dad's violence or whatever. Now they're responsible for their partner's violence. There's a whole trauma piece there that needs to be unpacked, where she could be clear about, oh yeah, they are responsible for their choices and I'm responsible for my choices. And so separating that kind of stuff out, it becomes very important, because it's not going to be helpful. We're not going to have a woman in phase 3 who's like excusing her partner's behavior by blaming herself. That's not going to be helpful in terms of actually repairing the harm that was done. Or this idea that, if she's made bad choices, that means she's bad. And again, she often doesn't have any template around repair being possible. I mean, just the expectations, often there are no expectations that their partner is actually going to take responsibility or engage in repair. That often the women that we work with in these circumstances haven't had anybody take responsibility for the violence that they've experienced ever. They don't know what we're talking about with the idea that the possibility of repair and taking responsibility and what it could lead to. They just don't have experiences of that. So that constructing that kind of template that might be possible is also important. And of course, women confusing the past with the present as well. So confusing their partner, their current partner, with past either partners or family members. But also in phase 2, looking at trauma and also identity. So just to show how it's important to also attend to gender as we're moving through this phase too. So this idea, if somebody's traumatized, for people who work in the trauma field, can recognize that people can become silent and withdrawn. They can become angry all the time, use alcoholism to cover up pain, avoid pain, needing to insist that they're always right or always win, because often they feel bad inside or whatever else, or pretend that they don't make mistakes, that they don't have any problems, or using violence. So we can see these as responses to trauma. But of course, if we went through this list and asked us, what are some ideas around masculinity that might actually prop some of these effects of trauma up? Well, if we look at silent and withdrawal, we know that there's this idea of strong silent type, in terms of masculinity. Or anger, we know we're fine with guys getting angry and pissed off, we just don't want them showing any vulnerability. Well, I just think about that in relation to the effects of trauma and how that might actually lead to guys thinking about that. Or the more you drink, the more the man you are, in terms of alcoholism, always needing to be right, always winning, again, ideas around masculinity and trauma kind of ends up supporting each other, or no mistakes or problems, violence. So part of this idea I'm taken to talking about trauma influence masculinity. So I think that there's an interplay here between uh, trauma and masculinity that I think we need to be attentive to, and attend to both as we're kind of moving guys away from their violence. Um, and then also in terms of trauma, thinking of oneself as only a victim, powerless, no agency, no mistakes, problems, only thinking of others, so that's can be effects of trauma. But if we think of traditional notions of femininity, in terms of how that can prop up this idea that women are only victims, powerless, no agency, and kind of normalize that stuff rather than seeing it as actually possibly effects of trauma. And then looking at the third phase. So again, this third phase where people would actually, so again, there's lots of preparation then in the second phase. And this is only for people who would be participating in terms of that I'm talking about. But again, people need to be prepared to be able to, just in life, be able to respond when they've been harmed in a way that leads to repair, and when they've done harm in a way that leads to repair. So the third phase is about really being able to repair harm in relationships. But again, the golden piece is the person who probably brought you into counseling, or which may or may not be able to happen, because you can see if both parties are coming in, they're not traumatized, and they're kind of like at you can move a lot of those people up to the golden triangle. If people are coming in today and they have a lot of trauma, the probability of both of them, in a short time period, both ending up like having enough of their trauma resolved and the issues around gender and being able to move into the golden triangle are become a lot less likely. And at the same time, we want to create the possibility where that could actually happen. So acknowledging the abuse, agreeing to a plan to stop the abuse. So again, there's proposals that are put out. We're asking throughout this whole process, what does, if the woman is the person who's harmed, what does she want to have happen in terms of just even talking about the abuse? What does she want in terms of acknowledgement? So we're not making assumptions, we're making preparation. Before we get here, we talk about apologies and whether that's something she wants or doesn't want, and talking about that for him too, so he's not making assumptions about that, or even the assumptions that she wants an apology and or what she wants him to apologize for. That's all worked out together. So it's not like him just taking a stab in the dark about what is, if she wants an apology and what she wants an apology for. That's all talked through and worked through together. So we don't make assumptions around that. Okay. And so then that leaves us with a better man as an example of this kind of phase 3. So really, I think the film ends up, it was called A Better Man from the very beginning. And again, I think the emphasis initially was going to be on Steve And just through the course of the film, it really came into focus that it was going to be about Steve, but it's also about Atia's achievement in terms of the work that she's moved through, in terms of her own phase, going through phase 1 and phase 2, and then arriving at a point where she could engage Steve for from a position of being harmed, but in a way that actually would lead to repair of the harm done to her, would lead to repair for him and repair for their of their relationship. But again, it's not repairing an intimate relationship. It's just it's repairing the harm that was done. So there's lots more I could say about all those slides, but I do want to open up discussion for any of the content I've just talked about that's going to underneath the film, or any questions specifically about the film.
Thanks so much, Todd. So just as a reminder to everyone, if you do have questions, please post them in the Q&A. I want to start with one just operational question. And it's two-part. You mentioned working with both parties. Do you always work with both parties, or do you ever have a situation where you're really only working with the one who's perpetrating the abuse?
Oh yeah, sorry, I didn't set, that's a great question. I didn't set that structure up well enough. I'm only usually working with the guy, so the person who's done the harm, and then there's another person who's working with the woman. And so we would be from the get-go talking back and forth, the counselors. That's part of being able to be in the process. So there's a whole monitoring safety. So that's part of how we're monitoring safety in that phase 1. So those there's separate journeys going on there. So I'm not the counselor for both journeys. I was talking about that as if that those are two separate journeys. And then even the facilitated conversations in the kind of gold triangle she's got a therapist or a facilitator with her. So there's 4 of us in the room, so, and there's different ways of doing that. I know in some settings, these are all separate functions. So one professional might be doing the safety piece, and then another might be working on the responsibility, like that might be a men's group. And then the phase 3 might be, restorative justice facilitators or family therapists or other people who are trained in intimate partner violence. So there could be different, this doesn't all have to be the same person all throughout here. There could be different professionals here in the at the different phases. At Bridges, where I work, we do a lot of the work from beginning to end separately. We would work with the people separately and then together. But you could also be in a community context where you would have, shelters doing the phase 1 work, and then you would have maybe men's programs doing the phase 2 work with the men, and maybe shelters or counselors doing that kind of work with the women, and then phase 3 maybe with restorative justice workers or family therapists or other people who are skilled at that. So there's just different combinations, and really just the triangle idea is just trying to communicate the process of the foundation being safety, and then working through trauma often if that's the case, so people don't get stuck in that and can move away from revenge fantasies, and they get unplugged from their childhood trauma as they're trying to attend to their current relationships. That happens through phase 2. Then phase 3 these kind of restorative conversations or communication can happen.
How do people find you? Do they get referred to you, or are you connected to?
So Bridges is in a rural community in Nova Scotia, and so because we're funded through the Department of Community Service and not justice, you do not have to be involved with the justice system to come into our process, although we do have people who are mandated through justice come into the program, but they also come in mandated through child protection. Well, and we also been in the community for a number of years now. And so, men refer other men into the program, in terms of to be helpful, so we do have a fair amount of men who are, come in voluntarily, and or sometimes just partner mandated because she's leaving if he doesn't get help, so that can also be part of it. But those would be but so there usually often needs to be pressure in the beginning. It just in terms of dealing with the shame that a lot of the men experience, or people experience around, perpetrating abuse, so there's usually pressure to come in. But that ends up being the starting point. And it's all right if people come, I mean, a number of guys do come in very irresponsible. So they are blaming their partners, they are minimizing, denying the abuse and all that kind of stuff. And there's a whole process of uh, redirecting the conversation to more responsible values. So in terms of how they might prefer to be in relationships. So it's not that they do come in with that kind of belligerence in some sense, a sense of entitlement, like you got the wrong person. This is, but again, I was trained initially just to confront all that kind of stuff. And in retrospect, I can see it just made it louder, in terms of I would take one side and he would take another side. And now what I find more helpful is just to politely kind of interrupt that stuff and actually ask the man what's really important to him in a relationship. What is he been trying for in his relationship in terms of love and caring and respect and kindness? And how does he want to express his anger? I mean, often guys, when they're engaged with those kind of conversations, like how do they want to express their anger, are kind of dumbfounded by that question, because often they just associate anger with yelling. They just think, what do you, like, they're not making any choice. And that's part of, a trauma experience that they come in with, is just that anger meant yelling and screaming and violence. And so when I'm asking them in those early stages, how would you prefer to express your anger? Most of them do not know what I'm talking about. The idea that we all would have emotion, and that, uh, we all feel angry, and there's lots of good stuff to be angry about. And how would you like to express that? They often don't know what I mean. Or conflict. When I say conflict, like, how would you like to deal with conflict in the relationship? Again, their template of trauma that they come in with is that conflict equals yelling and violence, so they're doing their best. They think they're coming in for like an anger avoidance course, or a kind of conflict avoidance course, when that's not where this is headed. It's about, how do we engage that stuff in a way that is, resonant with our values around respect and caring and kindness, and what the dads we want to be and the partners we want to be.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to ask one more question before reading some of the questions that have been submitted. You have been using the pronoun she for the victim survivor, and he for the abuser. And I wondered if you could talk more about that. Are you largely seeing, cisgendered heterosexual couples? Because we all know that abuse occurs in other types of couples as well, and those, those are types of relationships that we also don't see in our state-run criminal justice system for other reasons.
I mean, it's extremely important. I've got a lot to say about that. Yes, we do see, people from, the queer community all the time. And I would say that our field has not served that community well at all. And I think part of what's happened is because we've created it and we at Bridges I'm using that pronoun now just in this brief conversation, to just because people are so used to associating victim perpetrator along gender lines like that, so I run the risk of just reinforcing what you're pointing to. And Bridges' website really just talks about when people have been harmed and when they do harm, and just talking about people, because I think part of what happened when we just advertised our services as for men who've used violence against women, anybody from the queer community who saw that would just assume that we didn't have anything to offer them, which really didn't. But we would, if they phoned up, then we would offer something. But we know, then we would get that feedback. But we're trying to, highlight this. But part of what it did was it's made it seem like the conversations are completely different. That if you're working with cisgender straight couples, that all of a sudden, like, it's a completely different species that we're working with. When you dig into these conversations and you look at issues of trauma, and you look at gender and how gender is playing out in relationships, I want to be able to say both. Every conversation is different and is unique on its own terms, but they're not different too. It is not different across, I mean, the content can be different across, a queer relationship with a straight relationship, but the actual content and the way things play out in relationships, it's not different. The work's not different. And I think when we set it up as like straight services, gay services, or whatever, it just makes it seem like we're talking about completely different, like these people are so different that they would need separate counselors. It's just, that's not been my experience. It's like, and I think that, yeah, so I think that we've done a disservice over the years of, just gendering the who's doing the harm, I think, in the queer community. But I would also argue in terms of, we've also done a disservice for all the women who want to address their unhelpful choices, and that, because when we were so afraid to go near those conversations, we just wrapped them up as it's only self-defense only, and sometimes it's self-defense, and that needs to be recognized. But many of the women who we worked with over the years knew that often it wasn't self-defense, that they would make unhelpful choices in their relationships, and they wanted support to stop that stuff. But we didn't let them go there. We, just said, no, we're not here to talk about you having been, harmed anybody. We're just here to talk about how you've been harmed. And that did not serve those women well at all. But again, we didn't know how to think. We thought that we had to treat her only as a victim. We couldn't treat her as somebody who's done any harm, because then maybe we couldn't, like, hold him responsible, but also maybe then we couldn't just deal with her being harmed. But now, of course, we can deal with her as somebody who's been harmed, and probably more harmed in the relationship, than vice versa. But we don't have to dismiss the fact that she still might want to attend to her own, harmful choices in the relationship, which we never allowed for. So I think that there's been we've tried to maintain the kind of a sociological analysis of men's violence against women. So it makes sense that, men are perpetrating more violence, and generally, and then that would translate into family violence. But when we were holding on to that sociological analysis so tightly with the women and men that we were speaking with, that we used it almost like as a diagnostic tool. Like, I already knew that this guy was completely the violent one and completely violent in every way, and she was completely the victimized one in every way. It's kind of like we were using that sociological analysis as a diagnostic tool, where I had already worked out, what had happened before I even talked to the man. I already, knew that he wanted power and control. He used power and control titles, got power and control. I didn't even need him to show up in the room, because I had all of the story all written. Because I was trying to apply this sociological analysis to an individual, and I was just like oversimplifying his life, oversimplifying her life. I want to use that sociological analysis in a way that opens up my curiosity about how gender may be playing out in this man's life and this woman's life. But it doesn't predetermine, it's not completely absolute. I don't want to move into the gender essentialism that's, I've been, that I think the field is often, and myself have often been marred in. So anyway, so there's definitely limitations to just going with those gendered pronouns. So I want to put that out there. I appreciate the invitation to do that.
Yeah, thank you. And I think you're right. I mean, one of the reasons I asked is just because, one of the reasons, I mean, restorative and transformative justice has spread among certain communities is because they've been so excluded from the existing systems, and especially cases with women committing violence, or the queer community and whatnot. And actually, this leads well into one of the questions that's been submitted. You've referred to your old way of thinking, and I as well have evolved in my understanding and thinking about IPV. When did you make an intentional shift in your approach to the work, and how did you transition your work and your organization's work?
That's a fantastic question. Well, I was trained in Duluth, and again, that was helpful for all kinds of ways. And Duluth has changed over the years, so I'm going to talk about it as it was in the 1990s, not as it is now. But in the 1990s, I really, went to Duluth, came back with really an oppositional engagement with the men. They had a gender analysis and a social justice analysis that was important to me, remains important. And at the same time, there was a lot of this kind of oppositional engagement. So, and part of my movement was, again, moving to multiple stories. So the gender story is important. It's one story among many, trauma being another story that's important. And but in the late 90s, I started getting exposed to Buddhist ideas, and that began to kind of chip away at my kind of theoretical armor I had about how right I was about all this stuff, and I knew who the men were even before I even talked to them. So there's a kind of lot of self-righteousness in the early days. And then I get introduced to Alan Jenkins' work and Michael White's work out of Australia. It's worth looking up for people who are interested. And that really began to show me how I could hold on to a social analysis of this issue and also engage kind of in this kind of invitational, compassionate way. And what I noticed through that process was, well, two things. One, my theoretical armor, like when I was doing all this oppositional stuff, started to break away around that period when I just started asking myself, like, how do I actually want the men to go home and respond to their partners? And then I started asking myself, do I want the men to respond to their partners the same way I want to? That's the same way I'm responding to the men when they disagree with me, or when they say things that I'm like uncomfortable with. Do I want them to treat their partners like this, like I'm treating the men in group? And just over time, it was like, no, I actually, this is not how I want him to be at home. So part of that was kind of breaking apart that oppositional engagement that I had been trained in. And then, just over time, I think I just not just I started to, that broke away the stereotypes of who the men were and who the women were. So I was able to hold on to a sociological analysis without superimposing that on the individuals, closing down my curiosity. Like I had this all worked out before I even talked to them. And I mean, that's in part by breaking away. Part of what led to that was just actually listening to we always, it was just listening more to the people that we were actually talking to and allowing the complexity of their lives to come in. And that was allowed to happen as we moved away from this either or framework. Either you're a victim or a perpetrator, either you're powerful or powerless, and we can just deal with the complexity of people's lives and their stories and still hold on to the issue of responsibility for your choices. Again, that was part of what happened there. And so I get involved with the narrative therapy, and then restorative justice became a way of highlighting the fact that change was possible and that repair was even possible again, but we didn't even talk that way or think that way in the early days for the reasons that I mentioned. And then, starting to name clearly the trauma that we had always worked with in different ways throughout the years, but had never really talked about or acknowledged. And so just wanting to acknowledge that is, and that there's an interplay between trauma and gender that's actually leading to violence in these many people to violence in these contexts. And so, sorry, the other part in terms of change the organization, for the first year, I just started experimenting in a group with asking guys what kind of relationship, rather than assuming that you want power and control and then taking the conversation from there. I just started asking the guys, what do you want? What is important to you? And then I just couldn't believe what they started to tell me in terms of the vulnerability of wanting, their kids to feel safe, and that they want their kids to be successful, and that they want loving, caring relationships, and they want, and that they would be, but through being able to create safe conversations, the men were just much more honest than they had ever been before. The conversations became way more painful because the guys were actually acknowledging the violence. They were studying the effects. And I was shocked by the whole thing, but I also knew, my board of directors had sent me to Duluth. I knew we were all wedded into that power and control story. Like that was the only story that was important. So I didn't tell anybody for the first year that I was experimenting, and just with other questions and other ways, other lines of inquiry. So I kept it to myself and then I actually went out and brought a video camera, and I started asking the men if they'd let me videotape them, because I couldn't believe what they were saying, and I didn't think anybody else would either from that framework that we were in. And so I went out and bought a video camera, and then I had permission from the men to do this, and then I started showing videos of the conversations I was having with the men to the board of directors. And then that's part of how that change happened. And then the staff got it, and then it kept growing. Then it moved into publishing and presenting and that kind of stuff. But we were very nervous in the early days to move away from the kind of orthodoxy we were in at the time.
Okay, you spoke about acknowledging the abuse rather than taking responsibility for the abuse. Okay, so the question is acknowledgement instead of responsibility. I think this is an important distinction. Can you say more about that? And you also go ahead.
I can't. For me, I may have said that. For me, acknowledgement is part of taking responsibility and part of repair. So I actually see that. But is there a distinction there that you find helpful?
Well, I'm reading the question, so I think.
Yeah, okay. I think that, and just take a stab at maybe what the just I did it isn't enough. Usually that's what responsibility gets defined as. So in terms of acknowledgement, like I did it, as if that's enough. And I did it is important piece of taking responsibility. But when in terms of when I'm talking about repair and responsibility, I'm not, it includes acknowledgement, I did it, but it's also naming specifically what was done. It's also then, again, responsibility is acknowledgement, I did it, what you did, what the effects were, what you think the effects were. Again, we're not going to know what the effects were until we actually consult with the people who've been harmed, but again, it's laying the groundwork for that kind of conversation. So he's not arriving to that defensive in any way. And then again, looking at studying the effects, what the effects may be, which again, he won't know. That's the configuration. The person won't know until they consult. And then what repair would look like. So it's true. The I did it by itself is not what I mean by responsibility, but the I did it is a piece of it. It's just, it's kind of the front end piece. There's much more that needs to be done. Okay. I do think in the early days we thought, if the guy was feeling ashamed and he acknowledged that he did it well, that was pretty well. He was, he had done what he needed to do, and I just don't think that anymore.
Okay, thank you. All right, the next question. Thank you for an amazing conversation, very illuminating. I'm wondering, in that process of determining where a man is on the spectrum of A to Z, I hear you speak, as you say, Zed, I hear you speak to the survivor, which is fantastic, but do you also use any other tool to assess their readiness or accountability? And so sometimes,
yes.
Would you recommend a guy do a group intervention in phase 1 or 2 in addition to counseling?
Yeah, so so two things there. So we would always work with both parties separately. So that's just the entry point, so you would come in separate to the program. And then from there, both parties might engage in group work and individual work at the same time. So again, a guy may benefit from going through a full group in the phase 2 and so forth, with the possibility of phase 3 afterwards. Or some guys don't need to go in a group. I mean, we forced groups in the early days. That was really, we kind of had the story that all the men were the same, again, starting at A. But this idea that they were all the same kind of lent itself to a treatment that was a one size fits all treatment. You put everybody in a group. If all the men are the same, then you can just treat them all the same. Well, I'm not arguing against groups. Groups are helpful, but they're just not always indicated, So I want to meet with a guy individually. I can have very powerful, effective conversations with individual men. And also a lot of guys, like we forced everybody into group because that was the only plan that we had, because again, all the guys were the same. But that was really unhelpful, especially for the guys who I mean, if a guy was too scared to talk to me about the violence, and then I was going to put him in a group of violent other guys who've been identified as violent, thinking he was going to open up to them, it's like that's just counterindicated to put that guy in a group. He's going to go in there and he's going to either close down or be very disruptive. And really, I want to be, the people I want to move into group are the people who want to be there. I want to do that all contractually. I don't want to be kind of creating harm through that kind of process, which I think we did in the early days by forcing everybody into those individual groups. So we do a combination of that. And then even if we were doing, kind of conversations with the two parties together. We usually run individual conversations always at the same time. Again, that's monitoring safety throughout the whole thing so that both parties still have their individual. And because we may even have one conversation together and then maintain individual conversations for the next 2 months and then decide to get back together again. Again, it's just going to be depending on what on case by case basis about what the individuals in that case are going to find helpful. So there's not a one size fits all approach. Again, we're trying to move towards a responsive approach so that we can respond specifically to what's going to be helpful in different cases. We don't we don't use kind of tools in terms of, kind of numbers to get from phase 1 to phase 2. I mean, what we're looking for is, we're looking for somebody who can do those things that we're outlining in terms of somebody who can like acknowledge what they've done, who can move through all those kind of pieces around the trauma if they've been traumatized, that they're not coming in the conversation self-loathing, that they're coming in. I mean, for the person who's done the harm, part of the task is to be able to hold on to your own shame for having perpetrated violence and be caring of the person at the same time, which is what Steve, that preparation for Steve in that movie was. I mean, that's part of when I saw the rough footage in the beginning, that's what he wasn't able to do. He wasn't able to, Atia was trying to open up and talk about what happened, and he was just sinking in his shame around that kind of stuff. So part of the task is to be able to hold on to your shame and about having perpetrated abuse, but also recognize the value of repairing it. So you can not respect yourself for, of course, perpetrating an abuse, but that you could respect yourself for repairing it. And that there's a restorative function for the person who's also repairing the harm. Is that they get to do that in line with their own values, and that it's okay for. It's a big part of that early stage is also just giving the men permission, or people who've done harm, permission to feel ashamed about what they've done. That is actually okay. When what does that, I often asking men, what does that say about your values? The fact that when you think about what you've done, that you do feel low and ashamed about that. What's that say about what's important to you? And often guys will say, I don't know. And I say, oh yeah, well, if you could come in here and talk about the harm you've done and not feel bad about it, what would that tell me about you? And the guys are usually pretty clear about that. Oh, that I'm not, that I'm a monster or something. Oh yeah, so what would it tell you, or what does it tell you, the fact that when you think about what you've done to your partner, that you do feel low and ashamed? What does that say about your values? Well, the guy might say, well, that I'm not okay with it, that I do want respect in the relationship, that violence isn't okay with me. And so that we can have that idea that shame is evidence of actually his preference for peaceful, loving, caring relationships, and that it's okay to feel shame when we're off track from our values. So making space for that shame is a really important part of these conversations. So those are the things we'd be looking for as before, we moved into phase 3. And of course, we're consulting. If one person, they both may be in phase 3 and not want to have conversations with each other. They can, respond in a way that leads to repair, but they're just not interested. It's not part of their path anymore. So there's no like mandate or no thought that this needs to happen. It's only if both parties think it's a good idea that it's actually going to be helpful, on both their respective journeys.
Thank you. That was very helpful. So here's another question. You mentioned children quite a bit, and a couple of people want to know if you ever incorporate children in the work somehow.
Yeah, it's a great question. So we do periodically bring in kids. It's not per se counseling for children, like separate from their parents. It's really an extension of the parent who did the harm. So if it's a dad, being able to try and repair the harm done to the kid. So kind of like one example that stands out for me is a teenager. So a guy that I worked with probably for about a year, actually. And then so he was violent towards his teenage son, who was 14 years old. But one of the scenes here was the son was 14 years old, and the father described a scene in which he was in the basement with his son, and his son was holding up a bat against him to try and defend himself from his dad. So there was heightened violence in this family. And so then years later, then I'm working with the dad for a year, and now the son is now 22 himself and violent. So now the son's violent, dad was violent. And so the part of the repair that the dad comes up with is that he wants to, repair what he can with his son in terms of the violence that he perpetrated against his son. So we invite the son in to the conversations, and the guy is renouncing the violence in front of the son and saying, that was wrong, what I was doing to you. And the father says, and the son says, no, Dad, I was bad. Of course you were doing that. And the father's like, by this point, he's well into phase 3. He's getting like, no, you weren't to blame for what I did to you. That was wrong, what I was doing to you. I'm responsible for that. You're not responsible for that. So again, a father trying to renounce the violence in front of the son, trying to interrupt the message that his son got from his own, from his parenting, that violence is justified, and that there's an excuse for abuse. So him wanting to go back and attempt that is an important part of the work when those conversations with kids get to be set up, that can be important. I mean, just in terms of other examples around that repair, I mean, it's often very powerful in that phase 3 for if the configuration is a woman who's been harmed. It's often very powerful for her to hear the guy say that who was blaming her for the violence and the abuse, for her to actually hear him say, I was blaming you, and that was wrong. That was wrong for me to be doing that. That was my responsibility. That was my fault. Like, that's often we've been telling women for years, that you weren't to blame, you weren't to blame, you weren't to blame. But to actually hear it from the guy who was blaming her, she was blaming herself, he was blaming her. Those are often very powerful conversations for women to connect with in terms of addressing their own issues of trauma from him, even from the past, to actually have somebody who's harmed them take responsibility and not blame them. That those are, again, just snippets of what can happen through that kind of phase 3 process.
Thank you so much. I know there were so many questions and this was such a great talk, but we are butting up against our time limit. So I'm going to ask you if you want to share any closing thoughts before we all log off.
Well, part of my closing thoughts is I think that this series is a great idea that you guys are sponsoring in terms of just this kind of development and sowing these ideas and these conversations into our communities, in terms of just giving us more options about what's possible. And so, I'm very pleased to be part of it.
Thank you. We are really glad to have you. And I think it's just been an incredibly illuminating and fruitful conversation. So I wanted to say thank you to you, Todd, for giving us your time. Thank you to our interpreters, our captioner, to Torres, who's been helping with the tech. We appreciate the time all of you have given to make this possible. And with that, I will say goodbye. Sorry, go ahead.
I would invite people if they want to email me questions or concerns, or engage in that. You can find me through the Bridges Institute. We can talk more about it. Or if you're interested in hearing more about the work and how it happens, I would welcome if people reached out.
Yeah, that would be great. And everyone can find Todd's information on the Bridges Institute website. So if you Google that, you should find that pretty easily. Thank you so much for being so gracious. So with that, I'll say goodbye to everyone, and we look forward to having you join us next week. Thank you.
go. Okay, we'll be in touch.